Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle something I think everyone has felt at some point, disappointment. And particularly, disappointment in ourselves. You sent us a really cool episode, and it's from the Learn English Podcast YouTube channel. It's called Podcast and Chill, and I'm really excited to dive into this one.
It is a good choice.
Yeah.
I think it's great because it blends practical advice with English language learning, which makes it really accessible to a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly. Two birds, one stone. So before we jump into the content itself, what would you say is like the core mission of our deep dive today?
I think it's about moving beyond the simple feeling of disappointment, you know?
Mm.
So we'll explore why we feel it, where it comes from, and ultimately how we can turn, those yucky feelings into something more positive.
Ooh, I love it. Turning lemons into lemonade. Okay, so the hosts of this episode, Leo and Gwen, they start off by reminding us that feeling disappointed is incredibly normal. And actually, they cite research from the University of California that says nearly 70% of people regularly experience self-doubt. That's like, wow, that's a lot of us.
It is, and I think what's important here is their emphasis on acceptance. Instead of fighting those feelings, the first step is acknowledging them. It's okay to feel this way.
Yeah, so important. They even suggest actually saying to yourself, it's okay to feel this way. I'm allowed to be disappointed. Do you think that kind of verbal affirmation can really help to shift our mindset?
Absolutely. Think about it. So often we try to suppress these negative emotions, but that can actually make them even stronger. So by giving ourselves permission to feel disappointed, we take away some of its power.
That's such a good point. Now, once we've accepted those feelings, then what comes next?
Well, Leo and Gwen, they suggest we dig a little deeper. Try to understand the root of the disappointment. Where is it coming from? Is it coming from unrealistic expectations? Are you comparing yourself to others? Maybe it's a fear of failure.
Oh, so it's like detective work, figuring out the why behind the feeling.
Exactly. And sometimes the answer can be pretty straightforward. Maybe you set a goal that was a bit too ambitious given your current resources or time. And, if that's the case, you can adjust and try again.
Yeah, but I imagine sometimes the source might be a bit deeper, maybe tied to our own self-perception or past experiences.
That's right. And in those cases, Leo and Gwen recommend turning to journaling.
Ah, yes, the trusty journal. And they specifically mention a psychologist, Dr. James Pennebaker from the University of Texas, who advocates for journaling as a way to process emotions.
And there's real science behind this. Putting your feelings into words on paper can actually help clarify them. You might start to notice patterns or recurring themes in your thinking.
So it's not about like wallowing in the negative, but more about gaining a better understanding of yourself.
Precisely. It's about self-discovery and using that knowledge to move forward.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. The hosts introduce this idea of striving for good enough instead of shooting for perfection.
Yeah, and this comes from Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, a professor at Harvard who focuses on happiness. And he argues that perfectionism can actually be detrimental to our well-being.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in the pursuit of perfection, especially in today's world. But what does that even mean, to be good enough?
Well, think about it this way. When a baby is learning to walk, we don't expect them to get it perfect on the first try. We celebrate those wobbly steps and encourage them to keep trying.
That's such a great analogy. We wouldn't expect, a baby to run a marathon on their first day of walking. Why do we hold ourselves to these impossible standards?
It's a question worth pondering, isn't it? And that's exactly what Dr. Ben-Shahar wants us to do, to challenge those ingrained ideas about perfection and embrace the process of learning and growth.
I love that. So how can we apply this good enough philosophy to our own lives, especially when we're dealing with disappointment?
Well, it starts with recognizing that setbacks and mistakes are inevitable. Instead of beating yourself up over them, try to see them as opportunities to learn and adjust your approach.
So it's about giving ourselves permission to be human, to make mistakes, and to learn from them.
Exactly. And that leads perfectly into their next point, the importance of celebrating small wins.
Yes. They talk about how even those tiny victories can provide a huge boost in motivation.
Think about a time when you felt disappointed about something. Maybe you didn't hit a deadline, or a project didn't turn out exactly as you envisioned. Instead of dwelling on the negatives, what if you focus on one small thing you accomplished along the way?
Right. Like maybe you learned a new skill while working on that project, or maybe you simply managed your time effectively.
Those are wins. They may seem insignificant on their own, but they all contribute to your overall progress.
And those little wins, they can help to build momentum and keep us moving forward even when we're facing challenges.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about mistakes. We all make them, and they can be a major source of disappointment.
But Leo and Gwen offer a really interesting perspective. They suggest viewing mistakes as opportunities for growth.
They even tell a story about Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx. She faced countless rejections and setbacks while building her business.
Wow, I can only imagine the disappointment she must have felt at times.
But instead of giving up, she viewed each obstacle as a chance to learn and improve. And ultimately, her resilience and ability to learn from her mistakes helped her create a wildly successful company.
I think it can be tough to embrace that mindset in the moment, especially when you're feeling discouraged. But it's such a powerful reminder that mistakes don't define us, they're just part of the journey.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important concept, self-compassion.
Yeah, this is where I think things get really powerful. They bring up the work of Dr. Kristen Neff, who's known for her research on self-compassion. It's such a buzzword these days, but what does it actually mean to be self-compassionate?
At its core, self-compassion is about treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a close friend. It's about acknowledging your struggles without judgment and recognizing that you're not alone in your experiences.
Oh, so it's like that internal voice we all have. Instead of being our own harshest critic, we become our own best friend.
Exactly. And Dr. Neff actually suggests a really helpful exercise. Imagine a friend came to you feeling disappointed about something. What would you say to them? How would you comfort them? Now try applying those same words and that same tone to yourself.
That's a great tip. I think it's so easy to fall into the trap of negative self-talk, especially when we're feeling down. But consciously shifting that internal dialogue can make a huge difference.
It really can. And it's especially important when we're trying to overcome disappointment. Because self-compassion gives us the strength and resilience to pick ourselves up and keep going.
Okay, so we've talked about accepting our feelings, understanding their root causes, and practicing self-compassion. But what about motivation? How do we find the drive to keep moving forward after a disappointment?
That's a great question, and it's something that Leo and Gwen address directly in the podcast. They acknowledge that it can be incredibly difficult to bounce back after feeling let down, whether it's a personal setback or a professional one.
Yeah, I think we've all been there. You just feel discouraged, and the last thing you want to do is try again.
Absolutely. But they offer some really practical advice. For example, they suggest reaching out to a trusted friend or mentor for support.
Oh, there's something so powerful about just sharing your struggles with someone who understands. It can really help you to feel less alone and more motivated to keep going.
Exactly. And sometimes all you need is just a fresh perspective, someone to remind you of your strengths and help you to see the situation in a new light.
They also talk about the importance of focusing on small steps. Instead of getting overwhelmed by the big picture, just break down your goals into manageable chunks.
Yeah, this can be incredibly helpful when you're feeling overwhelmed or demotivated. Think about it this way. Instead of trying to climb a mountain all at once, focus on taking one step at a time.
And celebrate each step along the way, because those small wins can add up to big progress over time.
Absolutely. It's all about creating momentum and building confidence.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this insightful podcast, what are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should remember?
Well, I think the biggest one is that disappointment is a universal experience. It's something that we all go through, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us.
Right, it's part of being human. And acknowledging that fact can be incredibly freeing.
The podcast also highlights the importance of self-awareness. Taking the time to understand where those feelings of disappointment are coming from can empower us to address them more effectively.
And once we understand that root cause, we can start to develop strategies for overcoming those challenges.
Exactly. And those strategies might involve adjusting our expectations, reframing our thoughts, or seeking support from others.
And let's not forget the power of self-compassion. Treating ourselves with kindness and understanding can make a world of difference, especially when we're facing setbacks.
It's about remembering that we're all works in progress. We're constantly learning, growing, and evolving. And that's something to be celebrated.
I love that. So disappointment is inevitable, but it doesn't have to define us. By understanding its nature, we can actually use it as fuel for growth and resilience. Wow, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about not just dealing with disappointment, but like actually using it to my advantage. What about you? What stands out to you as maybe like the most valuable takeaway?
Hmm. You know, for me, it's the reminder that even though this podcast was, geared towards learning English, the advice about disappointment is so universal. No matter what language you speak or what goals you're pursuing, We all encounter setbacks in life. It's really how we respond to those setbacks that truly matters.
You're so right. And I think sometimes we can get so caught up in the specifics of a situation that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Hmm.
This deep dive has definitely helped me to kind of broaden my perspective.
And it's given us some pretty concrete tools to use the next time we find ourselves, grappling with disappointment.
Yeah.
Like that exercise Dr. Neff suggested about talking to yourself the way you would comfort a friend. I'm definitely going to try that one.
Me too. It's such a simple but powerful shift in perspective.
Okay.
Okay, so before we wrap things up completely, is there one final nugget of wisdom you'd like to leave our listener with today?
I think it would be this. Don't be afraid to embrace the journey, even the messy parts. Disappointment is often a sign that you're pushing yourself, trying new things, and stepping outside of your comfort zone. And that's something to be celebrated.
Beautifully said. To our listener out there, remember that disappointment doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something even better. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.